Well, thank you everybody, and thank you again, Quinn and the gang, for putting this together, because it's a great opportunity for us to get the site opened up. We're very early in our season right now. The bats welcome you. It's just part of what we're dealing with in these longhouses, things like air sealing and that sort of thing. The site was, what you see now has been here for the better part of 20 years, but it is still very much under construction, and probably always will be. This has also been kind of a nice opportunity or excuse for me to think a little bit about the subject of this talk. It's something that I've been kind of thinking about trying to put into some sort of a coherent framework, perhaps write something up at some point. And so it's still somewhat of a ramble, but it's just sort of my attempt to try to organize some of these ideas. And it really has to do with visitation to Kitselas Canyon being sort of the case study here. But this idea of cultural tourism, what we sort of understand cultural tourism to be today, is something that actually in this landscape has quite a long trajectory, over 100 years in the way that I've framed it here, that cultural tourism has been taking place in Kitselas Canyon and in other significant areas along the Skeena River, the North Coast, and the region more generally. And so in our sort of usual workflow through the season, we open up sometime around this year. We have a bit of a soft opening. Into sort of mid-May, we begin to welcome greater numbers of visitors, typically elementary schools, high schools, post-secondary, as they're closing out their year. July and August, that's sort of the big tourism season where we get visitors from around the world and around Canada. And then things kind of simmer down as we get into the fall. But just during that period of 4 or 5 months, really sort of intense activity, we get visitors coming from all over the place and for all kinds of different reasons. And what they see when they come here, obviously that's very much informed by their own experiences and through the lens of either education, tourism, recreation, whatever it is that brings them to this part of the world. Another big group I should also mention is just people from Terrace and Kitimat who have always sort of known that this was here and have never really had a chance to come down. And so that we're seeing much more of that type of visitation as well. So what I want to try to do with this is to sort of bring us back a century or so, to start thinking about the ways that newcomers, visitors to this area, how it is that they viewed and experienced this landscape, and the impacts, I guess, or the material effects that those different gazes, as I'm framing them here, have had on the site itself. Let me just provide a little bit of background. I know many of you are familiar with the site, but for some of you this is your first time here. Happy to be hosting the Northern BC Museum's conference. However, we're not really a museum. We definitely fulfill something of a museum role in the community in that we do have artwork and artifacts. It's something I can talk a little bit maybe later on the tour, but part of our work that we conduct throughout the year, but particularly from spring through fall, is in sort of cultural heritage management within the canyon landscape and beyond within Kitselas territory. My own background as an archaeologist, that's what sort of draws me out to sort of procrastinate and go walk around, and I'm always finding new stuff. I'll emphasize that again when we're on the walk today. You can't go anywhere here and not find stuff. It's just everywhere. This is one of the most densely occupied landscapes, in the Northwest. We have Within the National Historic Site proper, it's around 70 hectares, most of it undeveloped, most of it is forest and river, as well as some of the islands in the river. We have this interpretive center here with these 4 longhouses. We have a gift shop, which unfortunately is just closed for renovation right now, sorry, like so many other things. And a system of walking trails, some formal, some informal, that take us into some of the more interesting sort of historic or sort of heritage sites throughout this landscape. Of course, you're familiar with the geography because you're either from here or you've just recently traveled here, but we are on this really interesting pinch point on the sort of mid to lower Skeena River. And in a lot of ways, whether you're thinking about geographically, ecologically, culturally, linguistically, the canyon in this sort of part, this section on the river has often sort of been framed as kind of a midpoint between the coast and the interior, kind of a transition zone. It's, everything sort of below terrace on the lower Skeena River is much more sort of coastal rainforest, and we're certainly within that here as well, but it's not too far up the line here, as we say, up the line towards Hazelton, that you begin to experience a little bit more of that coastal interior sort of ecology, and there's a change in culture and in language and so on that attends that as well. And the people of the canyon, the Kitselas, which is just the anglicized Kitselas, that just means people of the canyon, they have for a very long time occupied this role of sort of, occupying that transition zone strategically for many thousands of years. This has been a really important node in terms of the vast trade networks, from the coast to the interior. That's something that we can talk a little bit more about this afternoon as well. And there it is, yeah, it's Kitselas Canyon. And one of the really unique things about working in this context is that we have not only the sort of very dense archaeological remains that I've sort of alluded to, and which we'll look at a little bit, but also an incredibly rich and detailed and intact history. The oral traditions for this area have been very sort of well taken care of. There was famously hereditary chief Nistahuk, who Ken mentioned earlier, who in the 1930s sat down with a white settler in Terrace and basically narrated his adao, his oral traditions. This is something that could take, depending on the family, depending on the story that you're telling, could take hours or even days to do so. And so they did this in sessions over the course of months, where he would come by and maybe for an hour or two he would narrate the story. And this fellow in Terrace sort of jotted it all down and then got it onto the typewriter. And the manuscript that came out of that turned into, I don't have a copy with me here, but I'll definitely show you a little bit later. It turned into this book that's now sort of, you can buy it at the bookstore, we give it out as gifts all the time, and it's the Men of Medik book, that volume. And it basically traces the history of one of the 4 clans, at least, their arrival from upriver in the Hazelton area, downriver to where they discovered and settled at the canyon and became the people of the canyon, and the sort of mythic or sort of legendary feats and wars and supernatural beings that they encountered here and all of that. And so just that book, having that, has become such an important sort of touchstone to be able to go back to and sort of read, oh yes, okay. And all of these places that we talk about and that we visit and that we work on here in the canyon, these are named and they're mentioned in the adao, okay, in the Tsintian oral traditions. And so we're just like absolutely bursting with sort of information that we can bring to bear, and different types of data, whether that's oral traditions, whether that's historical and archival research, whether that's archaeological research or whatever. So we know a lot about this heritage landscape, we've really just scratched the surface. There's so much more that we want to learn and that we want to bring back into sort of the awareness of this region, but particularly for the community of Kitselas. So that's kind of the overview, all right? And just for context, we're here. Okay, so you came in off Highway 16, we're down here, and then later on when we go for a walk down to the river, we're going to be sort of following this route up here to the top end of the canyon. Okay. So we do a lot of different things. Cultural tourism is definitely one of them. I sit on the board of the Terrace Tourism Society. We're sort of really, sort of increasingly sort of integrating ourselves into that whole realm, we're not doing a whole lot of really active marketing right now, but we are sort of getting our name out there. Hosting events like this is a really sort of great way to have exposure and awareness. But as I mentioned at the beginning, all of the visitors that we get really prompts us, I think, to consider the viewpoints that people have, the lens that they bring, the life experience, and so on. And for me, a really interesting thought experiment has been to put this sort of in the context of, the last century or so of people arriving here and basically saying, like, beyond just, like, wow, what an impressive landscape, what is it that they think about what they're seeing, and the people who are either living there at the time or in some cases not living there at the time. Okay? And as I mentioned, these views change over time, and the impacts of those different views, or those gazes, as I'm calling them here, has actually had material implications for the site and how it's managed. In this part of the province is relatively short and rapid, okay? Like mid to lower Skeena River, there are very few, if any, guys who look like me settling here permanently until the 1860s, 1870s, and very, very few really until really the 1880s, 1890s. That's when we get larger sort of influxes of Euro-Canadian settlers, Americans, Europeans, and so on. I have what I think is probably the earliest drawn map of Kitselas Canyon, and it was from an 1871 application for a land preemption in the area around Cleanza Creek. One of the very, very first settlers in the area basically drawing a map and saying, this is where I want my 160-acre preemption, please let me have it. Right? And this is before, 1871, that's the year that British Columbia is joining Confederation, but it's certainly before the allocation and then the surveying of Indian reserve lands in this part of the province. That doesn't come until the 1890s, in fact. So there's this extremely sort of, and I grew up in Ontario, where the period and the experience of contact, right, in quotations, is much longer, 400 years plus. Here, that whole experience of sort of initial contact between cultures, early sort of intrusions by gold prospectors, missionaries, and the like, and then really within a generation, vast numbers of people arriving on these riverboats, for example. That whole experience is just sort of collapsed into the space of a couple of human generations, and I think it has a lot to do with. Well, anyway, I'll get to that a little bit later. Really, the first major settlement, as I mentioned, is people coming up the river from the coast. The major settlement down at the mouth of the river at the time was Port Essington, and beginning in the early 1890s is when we get the sort of the golden era of the riverboat days, as we celebrate every August in Terrace as sort of partly the town's kind of celebration of its identity and heritage, the riverboat days. It's actually a relatively short period of time. It didn't begin until 1891 that we had regular commercial riverboat traffic on the river. And it basically all came to a screeching end the minute that the railroad was built, because the entire economic model of the stern whalers basically just evaporated overnight as soon as the trains started running. So, but for the canyon, this is a critical moment. The canyon for thousands of years has been an obstacle or a constraint to river travel, particularly upriver. Okay, the river is very low right now, and when we go down and look at it, it might even seem sort of placid as it's moving through. We don't have like sort of raging torrents and all that sort of thing, or rapids, I should say. But the river moves really quickly. It's a big river, and it's squeezed through a really narrow, rocky gorge here. And so, even in the best conditions, navigation, particularly upriver, is challenging. This had always been accomplished through the use of canoes by either poling or lining the canoes up through the canyon, or in times of higher water, simply offloading them, carrying the canoes up to the top end, and then continuing on. The riverboats actually end up mimicking this strategy. They can only really run at certain times of year, at particularly strong or turbulent sort of areas in the river. They actually have to line the boats up through the canyon. And I've got an image here of one of the stern wheelers. This is the Hazelton, lining through the canyon by way of cables attached to sort of these winches. I think they're called capstans on the deck of the ship. And they embedded these iron ring bolts into the sides of the canyon walls in order to facilitate this. Eventually, they sort of gave this up, and they ended up just parking one ship on the uphill side, or upriver side, one ship on the downriver side, and just freighting the cargo overland, the cargo and the people. And the trail that we're going to walk on this afternoon is basically that old portage trail that's just been sort of resurfaced. I'll just back up because I find this image quite sort of neat to sort of look at. These are obviously people traveling up the Skeena River on a riverboat. They're all very well dressed, and actually they seem to be carrying bouquets of flowers. And this fellow here even has a camera. So talking about the tourist gaze of the canyon and so on, it's sort of apt. But they seem to be going to a wedding or something like that. It's obviously a big occasion. This is a map, not the earliest map, but one of the early maps of the canyon. This one is based on a sketch made by one of the riverboat captains, where he identifies areas where rapids, where lining is necessary, as well as the location of the Hudson's Bay Company depot at the bottom end of the canyon, which facilitated this riverboat travel. So that's this little section down here, which was actually what's the word? It was preempted out of what would become Kitselas IR number 1, and then the trail overland up to the top of the canyon that's the route that we're going to be walking today. So we can imagine ourselves on the deck of one of these ships. This is, I'll paint a little bit of a picture here. The 1890s, all of these villages that I just pointed out on the map of the canyon, they were very quiet places at this time, okay? The 1860s and successive smallpox epidemics very, very significantly depopulated this part of the lower Skeena River, such that when those very early people were coming up, like for example the gentleman who drew the preemption map, would have encountered essentially the survivors of what is very much referred to as a plague in this part of the province. And of course, this is all up and down the coast. This isn't unique to this landscape. But through the research that I've done, spending time in some of these places, it's really sort of grown in my mind the idea that there was once a much, much larger population of people here. And that by the time Euro-Canadian, American newcomers are entering this area, it's very much the survivors of the plague. We're talking about a depopulation of 80 to 90%. And so many of the villages by this time, in the 1890s, when the stern whalers began mounting the river, many of the villages were no longer inhabited, at least not full-time, year-round. The survivors of these plagues by this time had moved downriver, either to Endadoon, which is at Kitselas IR number 4, it's sort of halfway between here and town, or they had moved even further downriver to Port Essington, where they worked in the canneries seasonally. And there was a period of 2 to 3 generations or so where actually most Kitselas people, as well as people from the sister community here of Kits and Kalem, actually lived in Port Essington rather than in their ancestral sort of territories. So the people coming up the river here on this riverboat would have seen what would be to them basically a wild and sort of pristine sort of jungle landscape, right? And we very much sort of get a similar experience or a similar kind of assessment from some of our visitors today when they arrive from places like Europe. You may know that Germans in particular are absolutely just fascinated by indigenous North American cultures, right? And when they get here, it's like, wow, we're in Western North America. Look at the pristine wilderness, look at all of the, you know what I mean? And of course we have to then sort of break the news, well actually, no, like nothing about this place is pristine. Like everything that you see here is the result of people and the impact that they have had on their landscape, for good or ill or whatever else. I'm going to point out on the walk later on some of the interesting plant communities that grow here that really should not grow here, but do so because people have lived here for so long. And they're viewing from the decks of these ships, essentially the decaying ruins of these villages. I mean, there are still, at this time, there are still probably a dozen or so totem poles standing. These are images of sort of humans and animals and supernatural beings that would have just been totally novel to these newcomers. They would have had no sort of context for knowing what it is that they were meant to mean. Like to them, it was very often taken as something very sort of grotesque and intimidating, and definitely something from a way of life that was in the process of disappearing, right? And you know, we're very much still in that period of sort of discovery. It's still before the rush to settle, right? Most of the people moving through this landscape are on their way up to Hazelton, okay? The Amanika Gold Rush and so on. That's where most of the settlement and then further exploration, fur trade posts and that sort of thing are all sort of occurring to the north and east of there. The Skeena River at this time is really sort of just a way to get to Hazelton. A difficult one, but a little bit faster than overland from the other direction. Okay, so this is, okay, well anyway, I'll leave it there. All of this changes very rapidly, as I said, when the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway was constructed. Especially, you know, for those of you who are either from Prince Rupert or from this area, you've heard all about, you know, the history of the Grand Trunk Pacific, the very sort of questionable sort of business practices that they undertook. This is the route that would, at the end of this period, up till the 1920s or so, it would become nationalized as part of the Canadian National Railway. But at the time, it was a privately owned section of rail connecting Prince Rupert with the interior. And I'm not sure how well that map shows up. This is Prince Rupert. And then we're coming up, and sort of this is the area around Terrace and Kitselas, and then Hazelton, and then beyond. And one of the unfortunate side effects, one of many, I suppose, unfortunate side effects of this bout of construction of this infrastructure is that railroads like to be built in sort of flat places where they don't have to go around stuff. Never fully materialized under the Grand Trunk Pacific plan. The hotel was never built, the bridges were never built. But a very interesting project is undertaken in the 1920s. This is with the sponsorship of the railroad, but through the actual expertise and fieldwork of anthropologists and conservators who worked at what was then called the National Museum of Man, today Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau. And the idea was to basically go out to these decaying village sites and to conserve, in some cases recarve and repaint, and then re-erect totem poles, house posts, and that sort of thing for the benefit of rail tourism. And sort of famously, or I guess infamously, doing various things to sort of change the character of the site for the benefit of being viewed from the railroad. And we can take this even further into the 1960s when highway tourism became really the dominant mode. And in places like Gatineau or in Kitwanga up the line there, the conservation, in some cases the the replacement of totem poles with replicas, the originals being taken to the museum in Victoria. But critically being stood up and faced towards the road rather than traditionally they would have faced the river, right? Because it was by canoe that you would have approached a village like that and seen the house fronts and the totem poles. So what we're doing here is we're sticking these things back up really to make them as visible as possible to passing trains, and then later to trains that are actually stopping and letting people go and walk around. This was part of the very famous, I guess, triangle tour of British Columbia. Really sort of a golden era for rail tourism in this part of the country. And the fellow named Harlan Ingersoll Smith was the anthropologist, or I guess the archaeologist, who undertook much of this restoration work on these ancient villages. And so these are some of the photos of his work during that time. He specifically worked in Kitselas Canyon in 1927, but this was over the course of 3 or 4 years. He also worked in Kitwaga and in some of the other villages. And so you'll see, and I'm just going to point out, I know I'm probably going to go a little bit late here. I'm going to point out this one structure in particular because it takes really central significance for some of the imagery I'm going to show later, as well as one of the sites that we're going to see when we go on this walk. Okay, so these are the structural elements, the remains of a fallen house. And that's the house of Gaum, or Gom. It sort of depends on how you sort of want to pronounce it. And anybody who's been to the Terrace Public Library, the gecko on the counter is named Gom. But anyway, Gom was one of the leading Raven clan chiefs on that side of the river, and this was his house. It was known as the Thunder House, and it was so called because it was very unusual for Tsimshian style architecture. It was not built into the ground in a sort of semi-subterranean fashion, but rather out on stilts, essentially, out over the bedrock, nearly hanging over the edge of what was then an island here at the fortress site. Really sort of like visually demonstrating, his authority and prerogative over the river. Basically, if you're coming through here, I see you, right? And but it was called the Thunder House because of the sound of people walking on the floorboards and the loud sort of echoing sound that it made being built out over the rock that way. So sections of Gaum's Thunder House were sort of resurrected, stood back up, and several of the totem poles as well. This is really quite a clear image, and you can see the construction sort of scaffolding or whatever this thing is. If you look closely in the foreground, you can see wood chips and shavings all over the place, and they were very much in the process of recarving sections of these poles, like so really pretty, in some cases dramatically altering them. I want to say with 95% certainty that they did in fact have First Nations carvers as part of this work. It wasn't just sort of Harlan Smith himself out there with a chisel sort of imagining what it should look like. But anyway, the site obviously being sort of cleared of vegetation at this time as well. You can see how open it looks. And then we have, as I mentioned, we've got posts that are sort of rearranged, turned around, for the benefit of viewing them from the railroad. These 4 mortuary posts are quite interesting. They were relocated to the uphill side of the right-of-way at sort of an elevation that would kind of be perfect if you were sitting in one of the old passenger cars. And it's said that most of these poles have since fallen down and decayed, of course. It's been a very long time, and they are made of wood after all. But these ones apparently were damaged by brush fire. There's some suggestion that the wheels from the trains would sort of throw sparks and create these little grass fires. And the charring of the wood of these 4 posts actually contributed to their preservation over time, because that carbonized wood will tend to persist longer than wood that hasn't been treated or scorched in that way. So one of our jobs this year actually is to go out and assess the condition of those, to find them first of all, and then assess their condition to see if they're still standing and what can be done about them, because they're right there next to the rail right-of-way, which is, set to get its treatment of herbicides and everything as it is every year this spring. And then I'll just point out really quickly this pole here. This is the On It Sleeps Raven pole. I'm going to show you bits and pieces of this pole later, so just keep it in your mind. It's called On It Sleeps Raven, and there's a raven at the top. That was one of the poles that was recarved and stuck back up in the air. Okay, and then finally, there's a picture of the site after this project is completed, and if you look closely in the bottom left, you can see a little pedestrian trestle bridge, and this is how people would access the village from the flag stop on the rail. Railway tourism ebbs and flows. Ultimately, it doesn't really become a sustained feature of the canyon here. That sort of activity has basically come to an end after a decade or so, as far as I can tell from looking into it. But the canyon is still a place that people come and visit, in some cases with great sort of frequency. There's a whole interesting set of photographs that we found, in the archives of visitors to, in this case, this is actually the Hudson's Bay Company town at the bottom end of the canyon, confusingly known as Kitselas, BC, referred to by the Kitselas community as White Town. And even after the railroad came through, the riverboats, were basically retired or sold to operate on other river systems. After that, this town sort of quickly was abandoned, and then in 1936 there was a very significant flood on the Skeena River that took out the remaining structures at that site. But in the intervening years, even this was a place that people came back to visit, and I haven't identified the people in this photograph, but it's very likely that these are people who perhaps lived at Kitselas during that sort of rail boomtown period. They're accompanied by, this is a Kitselas member on the bottom right, Simon Wallace, who is a hereditary chief as well. And they've all come back to the old town site for a picnic. And on my opening slide, there was a group of ladies with hiking poles that were basically doing the same thing. And so we enter this period of time where the idea of a sort of large-scale tourism enterprise kind of fades, but we have this sort of continued visitation, primarily from people in Terrace and the surrounding area, people with, in some cases, family ties, not only the Kitselas community ties that are obviously there, but also the people who were perhaps born in this boomtown, or one of the preemptors that owned, large tracts of land surrounding here. And there are all kinds of oral histories that were recorded in the 1960s and 1970s that talk about the days of the riverboats, the days of the railroads, and that sort of thing. And so there's a sustained connection to this place. I have a newspaper article here from 1969 that very much goes back to this idea of the decayed ruins. Okay, by now these villages that had been sort of cleared and sort of rebuilt, now they're all basically decaying again. The brush has come up, and this gaze or this view of the canyon is very much sort of local people perhaps with family history or local knowledge. We have a very active hiking group that emerges on the scene around this time, and Kitselas Canyon is one of their favorite places to go. Some of you may be familiar with Dave Walker, who was he was a school teacher here in Terrace, but he was also a big-time sort of local historian and you might say avocational archaeologist. And for years, he brought his classes out to Kitselas Canyon. They hiked in from the road. Of course, there was no road in like the one that you drove down this morning. They hiked in and looked at, the old villages and picked things up and collected them. And I can't tell you how many sort of Terrace old-timers that I've talked to about my job and where I work, and they say, oh, I've got something in my basement that we picked up, like decades ago. I should go fish that out. It turns out it's like some beautiful painted box or something like that, because, there's a lot of really, important stuff that was basically just on the surface. However, there's also this renewed interest in the idea of salvage, right? In the 1920s, the re-erection of those poles was that era's version of kind of salvage anthropology in a way. This picks up again in the 1960s and 1970s, and we have increased interest from the Royal BC Museum, the National Museum in Ottawa, and so on. And it was at this time that the remains, particularly the remains of those poles that Harlan Smith had re-erected, are actually salvaged once more, in this case by conservators and archaeologists working with the National Museum. And they're brought to Ottawa for conservation and stabilization, okay? This is exactly the same time that I was referring to earlier with highway tourism, and in some cases what happened is poles were removed from their communities and a replica would be commissioned to stand there in its place so that the original could go to the museum, because again, it's this disappearing culture. If we don't save it now, it'll be gone forever, and we've heard all this before, right? Also during this time, for the canyon anyway, when they conserved these poles, in fact they weren't totem poles, they were carved house posts. It's a very important distinction. This is a good example. Fiberglass replicas were made of several of them, and you can spot these in various places around the community. If you go up to the band office on the lunch break or wherever, you'll see there's one of these very impressive, very tall fiberglass replica of a house corner post. And I just want to mention, while we're on this image, the gentleman standing in the photograph here. This is Webb Bennett. Webb being an acronym for Wilfred Edward Bennett Jr. He was the longtime custodian, steward, caretaker, historian of Kitselas Canyon. Members of his family largely originate in Kitselas, but have been part of the Kitselas community for a long time. This is the elected chief councillor Glenn Bennett. This is his younger brother. You may know CJ Bennett Nabest. This is CJ's uncle. And you may have heard in the news or on Facebook in the last week, there was a pretty significant tragic death that occurred in the community of a young woman. This was her uncle as well. Webb and his father, Wilfred Sr., both died during the COVID pandemic, actually within a week of each other. It was a huge loss. It was right around the time that I was entering this role, and the idea was I was going to work with Webb, and I never got to. But he had a huge, huge impact on this place, and we're in the process right now of doing a little bit of trail work this summer, where we're gonna name a memorial trail after Webb Bennett because of the impact that he had on this place. But anyway, he's standing in front of these, in front of one of these fiberglass replicas. Okay, I'm gonna try to move a little bit faster here. 1970s, okay? This is the period of time where designation of National Historic Sites was a particularly popular thing to do. This is right around the same time that Gitwangak Battle Hill National Historic Site and all the others, probably North Pacific Cannery, I would guess, National Historic Site, got its designation around that time. Don't quote me on that one, actually. 1972, Kitselas Canyon receives its heritage designation. And again, this is, I think, sort of an interesting shift in how the place is viewed, right? What we consider to be valuable about this place, what it represents in terms of heritage, but also to sort of the living community here. And more importantly, who gets to sort of manage it and make decisions about it, right? And while the heritage designation was widely sort of celebrated at the time, it has led to, in subsequent decades, some tension about the authority of how to sort of develop a place like this, how to interpret the story for visitors, and so on. This also begins the period of time that Parks Canada is involved. And just a few more newspaper clippings here talking about that process. The one on the right here being in the Terrace Standard from sometime in the 1990s, talking about this idea of a historic park. Basically, the outcome is what we're sitting in here today. It went through many, many iterations, and I have, from Webb's office actually, I have banker boxes full of correspondence with whatever the iteration of sort of ISC or Department of Indian Affairs at the time, Parks Canada, right, the National Park Service, Kitselas Band Council, basically going back and forth and toying with this idea of developing a historic park that would illustrate and sort of celebrate all of this heritage that I've sort of gone through. And this took place over the course of decades. I won't really get into the detail there. Parks Canada was very much going to be involved, and there were negotiations to actually lease portions of the land within Kitselas IR1, where we are, to basically allow Parks Canada to fully sort of administer and run the whole show. Ultimately, Kitselas doesn't go for that, okay? As recently as 2008, 2009, Parks Canada is still involved in terms of developing ideas for some of the interpretive displays and that sort of thing, but it never really went anywhere. Whether that was the cause of just, certain individuals moving on or whatever the case may be, it never happened. Kitselas ended up doing it on its own. And anyway, all of this, I think, leads us to, questions or tensions that exist in any kind of an institution or a facility that holds heritage or interprets heritage, and it's the tension between sort of preservation or conservation or the sort of more broadly defined stewardship. And like I said at the beginning, we're not really a museum. We don't have a mandate to hold accessioned artifacts and to conserve them and preserve them, in a certain way. Of course, we do some of that. But part of what makes the site so valuable and interesting is the presence of people on the land, and we don't want to be a site where everything is sort of behind a velvet rope. The story of these house posts that were recarved, repainted, re-erected, and then salvaged, and then conserved in Ottawa, and then brought back here, and then stored in a shed, and now back here on site, and I'm going to show these to you this afternoon, is, I think, a really good example of this, right? Many of you are probably familiar with the dominant view in North Coast societies, Tsimshian in particular, but also probably Haida and other North Coast cultures, that when a totem pole falls, you leave it there. And the idea isn't to sort of like save it and bring it back and keep it the way that it always was, right? The idea is it goes back to the land. And rather than preservation of the material object, it's really a preservation of the tradition of making poles, right? And so as you came down the hill here, you would have seen the newest totem pole outside the Kitselas Community Center, which was just built. And this pole was just raised back in October. And so in North Coast societies, and again, I'm sort of speaking about this as an outsider, but my own understanding is that it's less about sort of preserving the old pole and making sure that it never falls down and never decays. It's more about preserving the tradition of making new poles. And so that's a tension that is, I think, very much on display here, and which I'm happy to be in that tension, right? When we go and look at these things, I'll talk about this. We don't know what to do with them, and depending on who I ask, they'll say, "Drag it back to the village where it came from. That's where it belongs." And others will say, "Well, actually, for better or worse, they're here now, and they're the only ones that we have left that are, in some cases." These are from the 1850s, 1860s. We should really preserve them, right? For our children and for their children and so on, because otherwise they'll never get to see something like this. Okay, nearly done. This photo was taken 2 days ago in Victoria. Kitselas is going through the implementation of its treaty, which was ratified by membership overwhelmingly last year, and the implementation of the treaty aiming for an effective date sometime in summer of 2028. One of the interesting things that comes out of the treaty process regards, in my view anyway, my little piece of the pie in this whole process, and there are much bigger pieces of the pie, is in culture and heritage, where lawmaking authority for heritage sites, for example, passes from the province to the nation. There is no real, outside of the Parks Canada framework, there is no real sort of national heritage conservation framework. That authority is devolved to the provinces, each of which has its own version of the Heritage Conservation Act or whatever. But a lot of those powers will then be, or at least Kitselas will have the opportunity to draft its own legislation regarding heritage and culture. And so we have what I think is yet another structural rupture here in authority over heritage, and an opportunity to, again, kind of like move us into the next generation. Okay, this is what we have in terms of how Kitselas heritage is being stewarded, interpreted, and so on right now. What is it going to look like in 25, 50, or 100 years? The treaty actually gives us a framework to view things in that long-term trajectory, because there's money behind it, and there's lawmaking power behind it, and so on. This is CJ Bennett, the best in the center. CJ's about my height. I mean, Evie's just a tall guy. Okay. I saw one photo from this week, and actually Ken's sister, who you mentioned, Anne McDane, she's probably no higher than about this, and it was Evie and like 8 Kitselas ladies, like elders, and it was just incredible. Just like this, and he's like this being. But anyway, it's a very exciting moment for the community, or at least the large sort of proportion of the community that is supportive of the treaty process. And then sort of just finally, before my last slide, a big part, I think, of what we do, what we try to do now, and what I think our aim is to go, into the future, is this idea of reconciliation through education. So using the legacy of all of these different perspectives and gazes that have had some sort of an impact, physical impact, or an interpretive impact on the site, and saying, okay, well, this is the resource that we have now. What can we do in our community? What can we do when we invite people to come and visit? And definitely, like this, the next couple months of the year here, where we get school kids coming, is like my favorite time, because we get to go hiking through the bush and we get to look at stuff, and they ask all kinds of amazing questions. The one on the right here, this is Kitselas youth as part of their culture camp, learning how to do archaeology and dig for sites. And I'm not kidding. We dug one hole about this big, and we found a stone tool in it. I thought, let's just go dig a hole. I'm going to show the kids how you dig a hole and put it through the screen. They'll get to look at pebbles and stuff. And we found a stone tool. It's just incredible. Okay, finally, just going back to the village of Gitlachok and the house of Gaum, right? The Thunder House, and the On It Sleeps Raven pole. That's what you see in the photo here. This is the earliest known photograph that I'm aware of Kitselas Canyon, taken by a geological surveyor in the 1870s. Talk about sort of colonial gaze and that sort of thing. He was there to look for gold and coal, but he had a personal interest in First Nation cultures. And it's really quite a nice image. We're very lucky to have it. There's very little photography from this period of time in this part of the river. And it shows Gaum's house when it was still standing, although crucially, if you look very closely, you can see that some of the roof slabs are gone. You can see some of the exposed roof beams. So it's unlikely that someone is living in that house at this time. If you look carefully here, you can see how his house was built out over the bedrock on these stilts, giving it that designation of Thunder House. There are these 4 carved corner posts, which I'm going to be showing to you a little bit later, and this is the On It Sleeps Raven pole. Okay, and like I mentioned just a second ago, basically taking what we have, taking what has been done, and sort of using it for our own contemporary purposes. This is our new logo decal design that we're really excited about, featuring Gaum's house overlooking the canyon. Crucially, we've removed some of the crest imagery and that sort of thing, but to give a sense of the beauty of the landscape and sort of the heritage that's sort of nestled there within it. So it's it's onward and upward, and that's all I really have. But there's my ramble again. Still trying to collect this into a bit of a coherent narrative, but I'm happy to take any suggestions or criticisms that you might have.